After being kicked out of her own home by her own daughter, Helen is heartbroken and decides to go to... Helen sat in her cozy living room, the warm glow of the setting sun casting a golden hue over the space. The walls were adorned with family photographs, each frame a snapshot of a life well lived, birthdays, graduations, and holidays filled with laughter. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of a photo of Emily as a child, her bright smile frozen in time. Memories swirled around her like leaves in a gentle autumn breeze, reminding her of the countless hours spent nurturing her daughter, teaching her right from wrong, and instilling values that Helen hoped would serve her well. As the soft aroma of garlic and herbs wafted through the air, Helen busied herself in the kitchen, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables a soothing soundtrack to her thoughts. She glanced at the clock hanging above the stove. Emily and her boyfriend, Jake, were due to arrive any minute. Helen felt a flutter of excitement at the thought of sharing a meal with them. It had been a while since they had all dined together, and she hoped to make the evening special. "Just a little more salt," she murmured to herself, adding a pinch to the bubbling pot on the stove. She wanted everything to be perfect, to create an atmosphere that would remind Emily of home. The clinking of utensils and the bubbling of the pot filled the silence as she hummed an old tune, her heart swelling with love. The door creaked open, and Helen looked up to see Emily step inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Hi, Mom," Emily exclaimed, her voice brightening the room. "It smells amazing in here." Helen's heart warmed at the sight of her daughter. "Just your favorite sweet pea, pasta primavera," she replied, embracing Emily tightly, "and I made your favorite dessert, too." "Wow, you really went all out. I appreciate it," Emily said, her smile genuine. Behind her, Jake stepped in, his presence a stark contrast to the warmth Helen radiated. He was tall and confident, with a charming smile that seemed to have a way of captivating Emily. Helen's stomach twisted slightly as she caught sight of him, but she pushed the feeling aside, determined to keep the evening light. "Jake, good to see you," Helen said, forcing a smile as she extended her hand. "I hope you're hungry." "Always," Jake replied, his voice booming with a casual ease that grated on Helen's nerves. "Smells like a feast in here." As they sat down to dinner, Helen watched Emily and Jake interact, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and unease. Emily was radiant, her laughter infectious, while Jake leaned back in his chair, effortlessly charming and assertive. Yet, as Helen observed them, a seed of doubt began to sprout in her mind, a nagging feeling that Jake was not the man he appeared to be. "Jake, how's work going?" Helen asked, trying to engage him in conversation. "It's going great, thanks. I've been working on a big project lately," Jake replied, leaning forward with enthusiasm. "Emily's been super supportive. She really believes in me." "That's wonderful to hear," Helen said, forcing a smile. It's important to have someone in your corner." "Yeah, she's the best," Jake said, shooting Emily a glance that made Helen's stomach churn. As the dinner progressed, Helen found herself struggling to keep her thoughts to herself. The unease she felt about Jake festered, pushing her to speak up. "You know, Emily, I just worry about the kind of influence Jake might have on you," she said cautiously, her voice steady. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Emily replied, her tone shifting instantly. "Jake's been nothing but good for me." Helen took a deep breath, knowing she had to tread carefully. "I just think it's important to be cautious. Sometimes people don't have the best intentions." "Are you serious?" Emily snapped, her voice rising. "You don't even know him. Why can't you just be happy for me?" Helen's heart sank at the defensiveness in Emily's voice. "I want you to be happy, but I also want you to be safe. Love shouldn't blind you to the red flags." "Red flags?" Emily shot back, her face flushed with anger. "You're being ridiculous. Jake treats me well. Why can't you just accept that?" "Because I've seen how quickly things can change," Helen said, her voice firm but laced with concern. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Emily." Jake leaned back in his chair, an amused expression on his face. "Your mom's just looking out for you, Em, but I promise I'm not going anywhere. You can trust me." Helen felt a surge of irritation at Jake's casual dismissal of her concerns. "Trust is earned, Jake," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's not just given." Emily's patience wore thin. "Mom, enough. You're making this so uncomfortable. Can't you just try to be supportive for once?" Helen's heart ached at her daughter's words. "I am trying, but I can't ignore my instincts." "Your instincts are wrong," Emily shouted, pushing her chair back as she stood up. "If you can't accept Jake, then maybe you should just stay out of my life." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, suffocating Helen's heart. "Emily, please! Don't, Emily, please me." Emily's voice cracked with emotion. "If you can't accept my choices, then I don't want to see you anymore." With that, Emily stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Helen stood motionless, shock rippling through her. The clang of the door echoed in her ears, each reverberation a painful reminder of the rift that had just formed between them. She felt as if the floor had been pulled from beneath her, leaving her suspended in a chasm of despair. "Mom, Jake began, but Helen cut him off, her voice trembling. "Get out. Just leave," she whispered, her heart breaking. Jake hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded, eyes filled with uncertainty. "All right, I'll call you later, Em," he said softly. Following Emily into the night, Helen stood alone in the silence of her home, her heart heavy with the weight of her daughter's words. The warmth of the dinner she had prepared faded into an icy emptiness, and the photographs on the wall, once a source of joy, now felt like reminders of a love that was slipping away. Tears welled in her eyes as she sank into a chair, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. She had devoted her life to Emily, had sacrificed so much for her happiness, and now, in a matter of moments, it felt as if everything had unraveled. The fear that had gnawed at her heart for months had manifested into a painful truth. Her daughter was choosing someone over her. Helen buried her face in her hands, the tears flowing freely now. "What have I done wrong?" she whispered into the silence, her voice cracking. The questions echoed in her mind, but there were no answers, only the deepening chasm between mother and daughter. A fear crept into her heart, one that she had tried to ignore. What if this was it? What if she had lost Emily forever? Helen stood in her small, cluttered bedroom, her heart heavy as she gathered a few precious belongings. The walls that once held laughter and love had become silent witnesses to her heartbreak. She carefully folded a worn sweater, its fabric still holding onto the scent of home, and placed it into a tattered bag. A framed picture of her and Emily on a sunny day at the park caught her eye. They were smiling, carefree, a stark contrast to the turmoil that now filled her heart. Helen hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the photo, but she quickly reconsidered. It was too painful to hold on to, too reminiscent of a time that felt irretrievable. Maybe just for now," she whispered to herself, placing the picture back on the nightstand. With every item she packed, the weight of her decision pressed down harder on her chest. The laughter of their past echoed in her mind, intertwining with the harsh reality of her present. She took one last look around the room. The memories of shared birthdays, holiday dinners, and quiet evenings flooded her thoughts. But now, those memories felt like a distant dream, overshadowed by the anger and betrayal that had driven her from her own home. As she stepped outside, the evening air was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories she had just left behind. The streets were unfamiliar, the sounds of the city swirling around her like a storm. Helen felt the weight of her solitude as she walked, her heart heavy with sorrow. Each step felt like a reminder of her daughter's rejection. The vibrant life of the city buzzed around her, yet she felt like a ghost, unseen and unheard. "Where do I even go?" she murmured to herself, her voice barely rising above the clamor of the passing cars and chatter of pedestrians. The streets seemed endless, and Helen's mind raced with thoughts of where she could find shelter, food, and some semblance of safety. She had never imagined her life would lead her here, alone and vulnerable, but the choices made by the one she loved most had left her with no options. As she wandered, Helen's eyes caught glimpses of the lives of others. Families strolled, laughter spilling from their lips, children running ahead, chasing after dreams she once shared with Emily. Each sight was a dagger to her heart, a reminder of the love she had lost. She felt invisible to the world, her existence reduced to a mere shadow flitting through the bright lights of the city. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the pavement. Helen's stomach growled, a harsh reminder of her new reality. She had always been the one to provide for her family, to ensure they never went without, and now she found herself in desperate need. The thought sent a wave of shame crashing over her. How had it come to this? Just as she felt the despair creeping in, she stumbled upon a small group huddled in a nearby park, their faces lined with hardship, yet filled with an unspoken camaraderie. They were sitting on a ragged blanket, sharing what little food they had. Helen hesitated, her pride battling her hunger, but the sight of their laughter and warmth drew her in. "Hey there, one of them called out, a man with a scruffy beard and kind eyes. "You look like you could use a meal. Come join us." Helen felt a rush of gratitude mixed with apprehension. She approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't want to intrude," she managed to say, her voice wavering. "Nonsense," the man replied, patting a spot beside him. "We all share what we have. It's what keeps us going." The others nodded in agreement, their expressions inviting. With a deep breath, Helen sat down, her body aching from fatigue. They passed her a piece of bread and some fruit, and she accepted it gratefully, feeling the warmth of their kindness wrap around her like a blanket. As she ate, they began to share their stories, tales of loss, struggles, and the winding paths that had brought them to this moment. "I used to have a family, you know," said a woman with a weathered face but a gentle smile. "But life happened, and here I am. You learn to find happiness in the little things." "I was a teacher," another man chimed in, his voice filled with nostalgia. "I loved my job, but when the school shut down, I lost everything. Now I just take it day by day." Helen listened intently, her heart aching for their pain, yet strangely comforted by their resilience. She realized that she was not alone in her suffering. There were others who had faced the storm and survived, albeit in a different way. As the night deepened, Helen shared her own story, feeling the weight of her grief lighten just a little as she spoke. "I lost my daughter," she said softly, her voice trembling. She chose her boyfriend over me. I didn't trust him, and I guess I pushed her away. Now I don't know where to go." The group fell silent for a moment, absorbing her words. The man with the scruffy beard leaned closer. "Family can be complicated, but it sounds like you still love her very much. That love doesn't just disappear." Helen nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I do love her. I just wanted to protect her." "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go," the woman said gently. "But you're here now, you've taken the first step, you're stronger than you think." As the hours slipped by, Helen felt a sense of belonging she hadn't expected. Despite their circumstances, the warmth of their shared humanity brought her comfort. They laughed and shared stories late into the night, and for the first time since leaving her home, Helen felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. The following day, Helen woke with a new determination. The streets were still daunting, but she knew she had to keep moving, to find a place where she could begin to rebuild her life. As she left the makeshift camp, the group waved her goodbye, offering her their best wishes and a small bag of essentials. With each step, Helen felt the weight of her past begin to lift, even if just a little. But as she walked through the bustling city streets, a familiar sight caught her eye, a cafe she had visited with Emily many times. Her heart sank as she approached, drawn in by the laughter and chatter spilling out into the street. Through the window, she saw them, Emily and Jake, sitting close, their faces lit up with joy. They were sharing a dessert, their fingers brushing against each other, an intimacy that felt like a knife twisting in her heart. Helen stopped in her tracks, hiding behind a lamppost, her breath catching in her throat. "Can you believe how lucky we are?" Emily laughed, her voice bright and carefree. "I'm so glad I chose you, Jake. You mean everything to me." Helen's heart shattered at those words. The love she had fought to protect, the bond she had cherished, now felt like a distant memory. She wanted to call out to Emily, to tell her how much she missed her, how much she loved her, but all she could do was stand there, invisible and alone. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she watched Emily lean in closer to Jake, their laughter ringing in her ears like a haunting melody. The pain of their separation was unbearable, a chasm that felt impossible to bridge. In that moment, Helen understood the true cost of her daughter's choice. The loss was not just hers, it was Emily's too, though she couldn't see it yet. Will she ever realize? Helen whispered to herself, feeling the ache in her heart deepen. Will she ever understand how much I still love her? As she turned away, the weight of her loneliness settled back over her, the city bustling around her, yet feeling so utterly empty. Helen walked on, her heart heavy with sorrow and confusion, unsure of what the future held, but knowing she had to keep moving forward, even if it meant facing the pain of her reality alone. Helen wandered through the dimly lit streets, her heart heavy with the weight of her circumstances. The cacophony of the city surrounded her, the distant sirens, the chatter of passers-by, and the hum of vehicles merged into a symphony of loneliness. As dusk descended, the shadows lengthened, and she felt increasingly vulnerable, an elderly woman adrift in a world that had turned its back on her. She paused for a moment, leaning against the cold, rough brick of a building. Her fingers traced the edges of the few belongings she had managed to gather, a frayed backpack stuffed with a tattered blanket and a handful of clothes. The chill in the air seeped into her bones, reminding her of the warmth of her old home, now a distant memory. With her stomach rumbling in protest, she knew she needed to find shelter for the night. Just a safe corner, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the city's noise. She had heard stories from other homeless individuals about places to avoid, areas ruled by danger and desperation. It was a precarious dance of survival, and each decision felt like a gamble. As she shuffled along, Helen spotted a narrow alleyway that seemed less exposed. It was dark and cramped, but it offered the promise of a temporary refuge. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the shadows, her heart racing with fear and uncertainty. She settled against the cool wall, wrapping her blanket around her frail body, seeking warmth. In that moment of solitude, she allowed her thoughts to drift to Emily, her beloved daughter. Helen's heart ached at the memory of their last encounter, the harsh words they had exchanged. "You don't even know him," she had pleaded, desperation coloring her voice as she tried to protect the girl she had raised. But Emily had stormed out, leaving Helen with a gaping hole in her heart that felt insurmountable. "Maybe she'll come to her senses," Helen whispered to the darkness, though her voice trembled with doubt. She closed her eyes, battling the tears that threatened to fall. Days turned into weeks, and Helen's struggle for survival became a daily ritual. Every morning she would awaken to the sharp sounds of the city coming to life. The sun would rise, casting its golden rays over the concrete jungle, but for Helen, each day felt like an uphill battle against an unforgiving world. She navigated the streets, searching for food and warmth, often finding herself at the mercy of strangers. Some offered kindness in the form of a sandwich or a cup of coffee, while others turned a blind eye, their indifference cutting deeper than any harsh word. Helen learned quickly that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. One particularly chilly morning, as she huddled beneath her thin blanket, she overheard a conversation between two younger women sitting on a nearby bench. "Did you hear? Emily is planning to move in with Jake," one of them exclaimed, her voice tinged with excitement. "No way, that's so fast," the other replied, a hint of disbelief in her tone. "I mean, they've only been together a few months, right?" Helen's heart sank. She felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Emily, her sweet, innocent girl, was moving on with her life, seemingly unfazed by the pain she had inflicted upon her mother. "She's really serious about him," the first woman continued. "I think she's in love. It's so romantic. They're even talking about getting a dog together." "Wow, that's a big step. I hope it works out for her," the second woman said, laughter punctuating her words. Helen pressed her back against the cold wall, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and betrayal. How could Emily be so oblivious? Did she not realize the toll her choices took on those who loved her? As the women continued their chatter, Helen felt invisible, fading into the background like a forgotten shadow. In the following days, Helen began to forge an uneasy alliance with her surroundings. She learned the rhythms of the city, the patterns of the people who passed by, and the safe spaces that offered the slightest hint of comfort. She discovered a small park where a few benches provided refuge during the day, and she would sit quietly, watching families and friends gather and share laughter, a stark contrast to her own solitude. One afternoon, as she sat on a bench, a young girl approached her, holding a half-eaten sandwich. "You look hungry," the girl said, her innocent eyes wide with concern. "Oh, sweetheart, I couldn't—" Helen started, but the girl interrupted her. "Please, I don't want it anymore. You can have it," she insisted, extending the sandwich toward Helen. With a tremor in her hand, Helen accepted the offering, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, dear." "You're very kind," the girl beamed, her smile brightening the dull afternoon. "I hope you have a good day," she chirped before skipping away. Helen took a bite of the sandwich, the flavors bursting in her mouth. It wasn't gourmet, but it was sustenance, and for that she felt a flicker of hope. Moments like these, however fleeting, reminded her that kindness still existed in the world, even if it felt overshadowed by the darkness that had enveloped her life. Yet, with every passing day, the absence of Emily weighed heavier on Helen's heart. She longed to reach out, to tell her daughter how much she loved her, how much she missed their conversations, their laughter, but pride held her back. How could she, the mother who had been cast aside, dare to intrude on the life Emily was building with Jake? As night fell, the park transformed. The laughter of children faded into the background, replaced by the echoing sounds of nightlife. Helen shivered, pulling her blanket closer around her shoulders. She watched the shadows dance under the flickering streetlights, feeling the chill of the evening seep into her bones. Just one more day, she whispered to herself, a mantra of resilience. But as the dark engulfed her, she couldn't shake the feeling of despair that loomed over her like a storm cloud. Would Emily ever understand? Would she ever look back and realize the cost of her choices? With her eyes closed, Helen allowed herself to dream of a different life. A life where Emily would return, where they would sit together in the living room, laughing over cups of tea and sharing stories. But as the reality of her situation washed over her, she knew those dreams were slipping further away, just like the warmth of the sun that had long since disappeared behind the horizon. The city continued to pulse with life, but for Helen it felt like a distant echo. The world moved on, while she remained stuck in a painful limbo, yearning for the daughter who had chosen love over family, all the while unaware of the heartache that festered in the shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, Helen huddled under a thin blanket in a dimly lit alley. The chill of the evening air seeped through the fabric, wrapping around her like a relentless grip. The stark reality of her situation weighed heavily on her frail body. Days spent on the streets had taken a toll on her health, and each passing moment felt like a struggle against the encroaching darkness. Helen coughed, a deep, rattling sound that echoed off the brick walls around her. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the tightness that had settled there. The air felt heavy, and her breath came in shallow gasps. It wasn't just the physical ailments that plagued her, it was the despair that clung to her spirit, threatening to extinguish the flicker of hope still lingering within. She thought of Emily, her only daughter, and the love that had once filled their home, now replaced by a chasm of hurt and betrayal. "Why, Emily?" she whispered into the night, her voice barely audible above the distant murmur of the city. "Why did you turn your back on me?" The tears that had become all too familiar trickled down her weathered cheeks, mingling with the grime of the streets. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching. Helen's heart raced as she instinctively shrank deeper into the shadows, fearing the worst. The city had its fair share of dangers, and she had learned to be wary of strangers. But as the figure came closer, she saw that it was a woman, perhaps in her 30s, with a kind face and gentle eyes. The woman paused, looking down at Helen with an expression of concern. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, kneeling beside her. Helen hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her mind. She had grown accustomed to the indifference of passers-by, their eyes averted, their hearts closed. But there was something different about this woman. I'm managing," Helen replied, her voice hoarse. The woman frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You don't look well. Here," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a container of steaming soup, still warm, and held it out to Helen. "Please take this. You need to eat." Helen's pride warred with her hunger. She hadn't wanted to accept charity from anyone, but the aroma of the soup wafting through the air was too enticing. Her stomach grumbled in protest, reminding her of the days of gnawing emptiness. With trembling hands, she took the container, her fingers brushing against the woman's. "Thank you," she murmured, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't think anyone would care." The woman smiled gently. "You're not alone, you know. There are people who care, even if it doesn't always feel that way. My name is Sarah. I volunteer at a local shelter. If you ever need help, you can come by." Helen looked at her, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and shame. I don't want to burden anyone," she said, her voice breaking. "Burden? No, you're not a burden," Sarah replied firmly. "Everyone needs help sometimes. You've been through a lot. You deserve kindness and support." Helen took a sip of the soup, the warmth spreading through her body, igniting a flicker of life within her. "It's delicious," she said, savoring the flavors. "I haven't had a decent meal in days." "Then let's get you more," Sarah suggested, her eyes brightening. "You can come to the shelter with me. We have food, warm beds, and people who will listen. It's not just about survival, it's about community." Helen hesitated, the weight of her pride pressing heavily on her shoulders. The thought of seeking help felt like an admission of defeat, but as she looked into Sarah's compassionate eyes, she realized that perhaps accepting help didn't mean she was weak. Maybe it meant she was brave enough to confront her reality. I'll think about it, Helen finally said, her heart aching with indecision. The thought of being around others, of sharing her story, was terrifying. Yet the alternative, continuing to languish alone in the streets, felt even worse. Just remember, it's okay to ask for help, Sarah said, standing up and brushing off her knees. I'll be at the shelter tomorrow evening. Don't hesitate to come by. Helen nodded, watching as Sarah walked away. The warmth from the soup lingered in her hands, a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. She finished the meal slowly, savoring each bite, and for a brief moment, the despair that had settled over her lifted, replaced by a flicker of hope. As the night deepened, Helen leaned against the cold brick wall, her mind drifting to Emily. She imagined her daughter happy, laughing with Jake, oblivious to the pain she had caused. Helen longed for reconciliation, for the chance to mend what had been broken, but the reality of their rift felt insurmountable. Days turned into nights, and time lost its meaning. Helen's health continued to decline, her body succumbing to the relentless conditions of the streets. She shivered through the nights, her frail frame too weak to fend off the chill. The cough persisted, and she could feel the weight of illness settling in her chest. One afternoon, while sitting on a bench in the park, she noticed a group of young people gathered nearby. They were laughing, taking selfies, and sharing stories. Among them, she caught a glimpse of Emily, her daughter, radiant and full of life. Helen's heart sank as she watched the scene unfold before her eyes. "Hey, look at this one," Emily exclaimed, holding up her phone. Jake leaned in closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. They were so close, so happy, and Helen felt a pang of longing that twisted in her gut. "Can you believe how lucky we are?" Emily said, her voice bubbling with joy. "I can't wait to see what the future holds for us." Helen's breath hitched in her throat. The future. She had once envisioned a future filled with love and connection with her daughter. Now, that future seemed like a distant memory, a cruel twist of fate that had left her abandoned and alone. As she sat there, invisible to the world around her, Helen's heart ached. She wanted to call out to Emily to remind her of the bond they once shared, but the words caught in her throat. She was afraid of the rejection, the reminder that she was no longer part of her daughter's life. Suddenly, Emily raised her phone for another photo, her laughter ringing through the air like music. "Say cheese," she called out, and the group erupted in cheerful voices, their happiness a stark contrast to Helen's solitude. In that moment, Helen felt the weight of her despair settle over her like a shroud. She turned away, unable to witness the joy that was now out of reach. With each step she took, the distance between her and her daughter felt insurmountable, a chasm that had formed in the wake of betrayal and misunderstanding. As night fell, Helen returned to her alley, the darkness wrapping around her like an old, familiar friend. She curled up under her blanket, clutching the empty soup container to her chest. The kindness of Sarah lingered in her mind, a reminder that there was still compassion in the world. But as she closed her eyes, the ache for Emily overshadowed everything else. The flicker of hope that had ignited in her heart felt dim once more. She wished for a way to bridge the gap, to reach out across the divide and pull her daughter back into her embrace. But the reality was stark, and the pain of separation weighed heavily on her soul, leaving her to wrestle with the unrelenting sorrow of a love that had been severed. Helen sat alone on a weathered bench in the park, a place that had once been vibrant with laughter and life. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the distant sounds of children playing felt like echoes from a different life, one that seemed unreachable now. She wrapped her thin sweater tighter around her frail body, her fingers trembling as she clutched the fabric. It had been weeks since she had a decent meal, and the gnawing hunger in her stomach was only a shadow of the ache in her heart. Her mind drifted back to the days when Emily was a child, her laughter ringing through their home like music. She remembered the warmth of those moments, baking cookies together, reading stories at bedtime, and sharing secrets that felt sacred. But those memories now felt tainted, overshadowed by the bitter reality of their recent estrangement. Helen had devoted her entire life to ensuring Emily was happy and safe, yet here she was, alone and abandoned, cast aside by the very person she had loved most fiercely. As Helen closed her eyes, exhaustion washed over her. She leaned back against the bench, the rough wood digging into her back. Her thoughts turned to Emily's face, bright and full of life, her eyes alight with a passion that Helen had once admired. But that passion had turned into a blind loyalty to Jake, a man Helen had never trusted. The more she thought about it, the more her heart ached. How could my own daughter choose him over me? She whispered to the empty park, her voice barely a breath. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness swept over her. The world around her began to blur, and she struggled to focus. Just a moment, she thought. Just a moment to rest. But as her vision faded, so did her strength. Helen felt herself slipping away, the noise of the park fading into a distant hum. She didn't know if she was dreaming or if this was truly the end, but in that moment she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. Perhaps it was the release from the pain, the burden of betrayal, and the loss of her daughter's love. In her final moments, memories flickered like the pages of a cherished book. She saw Emily's first steps, her first day at school, the prom dress she had helped her choose. I loved you so much, Helen thought, tears spilling down her cheeks. I tried to protect you. But as swiftly as the memories came, they were replaced by the ache of betrayal. Helen wished fervently for reconciliation, for a chance to explain herself, to make Emily understand that her intentions had always been rooted in love. Emily, please, she murmured, her voice cracking. I never meant to hurt you. But the words faded into the stillness of the park, swallowed by the leaves rustling in the wind. She could almost hear her daughter's laughter, but it felt like a cruel reminder of what had been lost. As the darkness began to close in, Helen's heart ached not just for herself, but for the daughter who had turned her back on the very essence of their bond. Meanwhile, in a nearby cafe, Emily sat across from Jake, her gaze fixed on him as he animatedly spoke about his plans for the future. She should have felt fulfilled, but a nagging sensation tugged at her heart. She had pushed her mother away, convinced that her relationship with Jake was worth it. But now, as she watched him, the flicker of doubt ignited within her. Are you okay? Jake asked, noticing her distracted expression. You've been quiet today. Emily forced a smile, shaking her head as if to dispel her thoughts. Yeah, just tired, I guess. It's been a long week. Jake leaned closer, a hint of concern in his eyes. You know I'm here for you, right? Whatever you need. She nodded, but the words felt hollow. I know. A part of her wanted to confide in him about her mother, to share the turmoil that brewed beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life. But the fear of judgment held her back, and so she smiled, masking the turmoil within. Just then, her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. Glancing at the screen, she saw a notification from a news app. Local woman found deceased in park, the headline read. A chill raced down her spine, but she quickly dismissed it. It's probably just another homeless person, she thought, the urgency of the moment slipping away. Hey, why don't we check out that new movie tonight? Jake suggested, his eyes brightening with excitement. I heard it's really good. Sure, Emily replied absent-mindedly, still caught in the web of her thoughts. She felt a fleeting twinge of concern for the woman mentioned in the article, but it was quickly overshadowed by Jake's enthusiastic chatter about the film. Helen's breaths became shallow, and the world around her faded into shadows. She felt herself slipping away, her spirit lifting as if to escape the pain of her reality. As the last remnants of her consciousness faded, she held on to the love she had for Emily, the hope that somehow, somewhere, they would find each other again. The park remained still, the sun setting in a blaze of colors that Helen would never see again. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, but all that surrounded her now was silence. She had given everything to her daughter, her love, her sacrifices, her very life, and yet in this moment she felt utterly alone. Emily, still lost in her bubble of denial, would never know the depth of her mother's pain, the love that had endured through the betrayal. As darkness enveloped Helen, a final thought crossed her mind. I hope you remember me, Emily. I hope you know I loved you until my last breath. And with that, Helen drifted away, leaving behind a world that had forgotten her, while Emily continued to forge ahead, blissfully unaware of the price that had been paid for her choices. The air was heavy with a somber stillness as Emily stepped into the small chapel, its muted tones and flickering candles enveloping her like a heavy shroud. It was a place she had never envisioned stepping into for her mother, but here she was, grappling with the uncomfortable reality of Helen's funeral. The pews were filled with familiar faces, friends, neighbors, and a few distant relatives, each one wearing a mask of sorrow, though some exchanged glances that hinted at judgment. Emily felt the weight of their gazes, as if they could see through her carefully constructed facade, exposing the turmoil swirling inside her. "Why did you even come?" she muttered to herself, wishing she could simply vanish. In her heart, she still clung to the belief that distancing herself from Helen had been the right choice. She had needed to protect herself after all. The nagging whispers of doubt, however, crept into her mind, prickling at her conscience. Silent tears threatened to spill as she took her seat, the wood creaking beneath her weight, echoing her inner conflict. The eulogies began, delivered by solemn friends and neighbors who spoke of Helen's kindness, her unwavering love for her family, and the countless sacrifices she had made throughout her life. Each word seemed to echo through Emily, amplifying the guilt that gnawed at her insides. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, trying to drown out the memories of their last argument, the words flung like daggers between them. "Helen was a pillar of strength," one of the speakers said, his voice cracking slightly. "She would give the shirt off her back to anyone in need, always putting others before herself." Emily's chest tightened. She had never understood the depth of her mother's sacrifices until now. The weight of the past crashed down upon her, suffocating any remnants of the resolve she had clung to. She glanced around, catching the gaze of an older woman seated a few rows ahead. The woman, with silver hair and kind eyes, seemed to sense Emily's turmoil. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, and Emily looked away, feeling exposed. As the service continued, Emily's thoughts drifted. She thought of Jake, his laughter, the way he had swept her off her feet, but there was a shadow in her heart that whispered that maybe she had been too quick to dismiss her mother's concerns. Had she truly understood the implications of her choices? The thought twisted inside her, tightening like a noose. When the eulogies concluded, the guests began to disperse, but Emily remained seated, lost in thought. Suddenly, she felt a presence beside her. It was a stranger, a woman in her 60s, with gentle eyes that held a depth of understanding. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here alone." Emily looked up, an eyebrow raised. "I'm fine," she replied curtly. The woman, however, didn't seem deterred. "I was with your mother in her final moments," the woman continued, her voice steady yet filled with compassion. "I held her hand." Emily's heart raced at the unexpected admission. "She spoke of you, you know," the woman added, her gaze unwavering. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What did she say?" she stammered, the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. "She talked about how much she loved you," the woman replied, her voice warm. "Even in the darkest moments, she held on to that love. She was so proud of you despite everything." A lump formed in Emily's throat, the words striking her like a physical blow. She wanted to deny it, to reject the notion that her mother had any love left for her after the bitter words they had exchanged, but the woman's eyes held a truth that pierced through her defenses. "She wished she could have reached you," the woman continued, her voice soothing. "She wanted you to know that her love was unconditional. In her last moments, all she could think about was you." Emily's heart raced as tears threatened to spill over. I didn't want it to end this way," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing what was best for me." The woman nodded, her expression empathetic. "It's easy to lose sight of what truly matters when we're caught up in our own lives, but love is a complicated thing. Your mother understood that." As the woman spoke, Emily's mind raced back to the last conversation she had with Helen. The anger, the accusations, the pain, all of it felt like a distant nightmare now, one that she couldn't escape. The realization of her mother's love, even in the face of their conflict, began to seep into her heart, mingling with the guilt that had taken root. "I wish I could take it all back," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I wish I could tell her I love her too." The woman placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder, and for a moment Emily felt a flicker of solace in the warmth of the stranger's touch. "Then honor her memory," the woman urged gently. "Live your life in a way that would make her proud." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face now. She wiped at them with the back of her hand, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I don't even know how to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled softly. One step at a time. And remember, it's never too late to celebrate the love you shared. As the service came to a close, Emily found herself lingering, the weight of her mother's absence settling heavily on her heart. She felt a sudden urge to search through Helen's belongings to find anything that could bridge the chasm that had grown between them. As the chapel emptied, Emily approached the small table where Helen's belongings were displayed. There were flowers, a few framed photographs, and a small box that caught her eye. She opened it gently, revealing a stack of letters, each one carefully folded, the ink still fresh despite the time that had passed. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was addressed to her, and her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The familiar handwriting sent a rush of emotions through her, and she began to read. "My dearest Emily," it started. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, and I want you to know that my love for you never wavered, even when we fought. I wish things had been different, but my heart always carried you, no matter the distance between us. You have always been my pride and joy, and I hope one day you can forgive me for any pain I may have caused you. Please remember, love is stronger than any disagreement, and it is my wish that you find happiness in your life." Emily's breath hitched as she read the words, each one a balm to her aching heart. The guilt that had threatened to consume her began to shift into something else. An understanding that the love she had thought was lost was still very much alive, even in its absence. As she finished the letter, Emily realized that while the pain of loss would linger, so too would the love her mother had for her. The void would always be there, but it would be filled with the memories of the woman who had given her everything. With tears streaming down her face, Emily whispered a silent promise to her mother, one that echoed in the quiet chapel and beyond. She would live her life in a way that honored Helen's love, ensuring that it would never be forgotten. And as she stepped out into the light, the weight of her choices felt a little lighter, replaced by the flicker of hope for what could still be. A life lived in love for both herself and for Helen.